come to History 12, and we're looking at something which is phenomenally difficult to appreciate, and that is that history is not a record of the past. It is extremely difficult also to appreciate that political forms are fictive, and that one of the flaws in civilization is trying to arrange human beings in groups of political structure, which throws the weight of decision exclusively on the mind. The first casualty of that error is that nature is confused with material. Nature are things which to the mind can be manipulated and moved around. And as the power of human beings has shot itself asymptotically off the graph, nature in that old identification has become a pariah in human life, because material is something which, since you can manipulate it and commandeer it, it is secondary to the mind's power. And it means then that political forms allied with economic strategies that has an identification with set codified laws of procedure, that all of this then is sufficient to run the world. We have seen just in this past week the Senate Judicial Committee interviewing for Chief Supreme Court Justice John Robert, and even under direct, humane appeal from people like Senator Feinstein or Senator Biden, the nominee retreated back to procedural fencing of the conversation and threw it into an ideological mask. And even under that aegis was able to say, I'm not an ideologue, when he was clearly showing the kind of ideologue stance that we have seen too many times in the 20th century. Two of the most powerful events of that nature occurred in Europe in the early part of the 20th century. The first time that it raised itself to the level of an ideology convincing itself mentally that it was simply being realistic and was not just an ideology, was after the Second Russian Revolution, when Marxist historical materialism received an impress from Lenin's successful revolution, and Marxist-Leninism declared that the entirety of the Russian Empire, carefully assembled by the czars for several hundred years, became then the nascent communistic Soviet Union that very quickly evolved and cemented itself under the man who took over from Lenin, Stalin. Stalin in Russian means steel man. And right away, with Stalin, one saw the beginnings in the 1930s of the persecutions of anyone who did not agree, and the extraction of all who were not participating in the making of this ideological structure to be exiled to work concentration camps, mostly beyond the Urals in Siberia. I have a relative by marriage who was so far in the Siberian taiga that they did not hear until 2 years after the Second World War was over that it was over. The other example was Nazi Germany that came into power in 1933, but already by 1923 was beginning about the same time as Marxist-Leninist communism was rearing itself. And so one had the spectacle of two totalitarian states rising very similarly at the same time in vying by overlapping territories. And the central big issue between them immediately was who was going to take over an area of the Baltic that surrounds the city. Its name was Königsberg, and it's in Königsberg that Hannah Arendt grew up. And we're taking Hannah Arendt, The Human Condition, as one of our pairs of books, along with Hegel, his lectures on philosophy of world history, because it is Hegel's philosophic work that Marx used, turned it upside down, and then turned it inside out. And it was on that basis that Marx thought out his dialectical materialist critique of human life and society. But it was thought out in the most unlikely of places. It was thought out in the British Museum. He was just reading while he was a reporter for a New York newspaper. So that Marxism has a peculiar ideological complexity to it, and was able to be used by someone of the revolutionary intensity and brilliance of Lenin to form a cudgel that in very brutal hands like Stalin insisted for more than 3 generations on making an ideological empire. Nazi Germany lasted just 12 years. But its intensity was even more severe. And that area where Hannah Arendt grew up, Königsberg, was for a very long time a part of Prussia, which ran along the Baltic coast and into some parts of Germany, but had in historical times also belonged to Swedish empires, sometimes Russian claims. And that city was also the home of the greatest philosopher who began the modern age of thought, Emmanuel Kant. About the time that the American Revolution was turning a corner in its battle for independence, 1781, Immanuel Kant published the first of 3 critiques out of the university in Königsberg. And the first one was the critique of pure reason. The second was the critique of practical reason. And the third was the critique of judgment. And it was a series of critiques bringing in something new, a critical philosophy that was transcendental to the mind. that the mind had an ability to go beyond its limits, beyond its shape, and when it did so, its critical capacity exceeded its synthetic power. And this was a huge undertaking. And towards the end of her life, Hannah Arendt was rewriting Kant's three critiques. The first one was called Thinking. The second volume was called Willing. Thinking was the critique of pure reason redone by Hannah Arendt in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And the second one, Willing, was a redoing of the critique of practical reason. And she had just begun to type the title and the first page of the critique of judgment when she died in New York in December of 1975. Her work, which is one of the most extraordinary achievements of the whole philosophic era, her work was held to be one of the crucial, unfinished works of philosophy of all time. Her lectures on Kant's political philosophy were collected together and published as kind of like a précis of what she would have written, which would have been her greatest work. Now, she achieved world fame by writing The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she took a direct, in-depth look at the totalitarian quality that is there in civilization, especially the Nazis and especially the communists, but the interplay between them in such a way that she was honing in on being able, from a deeply advantaged standpoint, to understand something overwhelmingly apparent, which no one had adequately gotten to before, though it had been broached a number of times, and which in our learning we're making as clear as can possibly be. The fly in the ointment of civilizations are political forms. Political forms make good mental plans. They beggar the complexity of human lives when especially human beings are capable of maturing beyond mere individuality. They're capable of maturing into widely differential persons for whom freedom is not a right, but for whom freedom is a dimension of their actuality. And to reduce freedom to a political right away co-opts the entire maturity further than the mind into simply an idea, which can be elaborated and expanded, can be sent out to have its identification with ritual comportments in the physical world, and in between those two identifying poles, experience is co-opted more and more into the right versions that this conservative new tradition brings into play, and you have a false situation, not an ecology that is natural at all, because it's fully natural for human beings, especially to go beyond the state, to go beyond the political forms. And it's as simple as just saying, for openers, everyone dreams. In order to have dreaming, one has to have an influx into the mind from a little bit of vision. Otherwise, the images do not have a chance to form in dreaming. And it's interesting because the symbolic mind, when it receives both images from experience, from the mythic horizon of experience, and from the visionary differential horizon of consciousness, those two coming in complementary directions. The directions are not left and right, north and south, up and down. The directions are integral and differential. And when the differential consciousness of vision and the integral imagery of mythic experience come together, they weave, like all energy waveforms will weave, they weave patterns. So that the symbolic mind comes into possession for the first time. As a little bit of conscious vision comes into play, the mind achieves an ability not only to synthesize and integrate, but to have a complementarity where patterning becomes apparent. And it is the patterning of symbols that introduces for the first time the ability for the memory to form and for the imagination to have a quality where it can imagine things not yet seen, not yet heard. And so it acquires a faculty of creative imagination. And right away, it's not so very big, but the first thing that happens when creative imagination begins to play in human beings, they start to play. Little, tiny kids, when they start to play, they play not in a fictive world, they play in a creative envisioning. Play is not a fiction. Political forms are fiction. Political parties are an addicted fiction. But children play, and it's not just that children play, all young life forms that have sentience will tend to play. Puppies play. Kittens play. I remember seeing a baby rhinoceros at the LA Zoo about 15 years ago, and it was scampering about playing. This big 200-pound baby, and it was just having fun, running as fast as it could and sliding into the mud and getting its mother all muddy, and then it would go around and do it again. I remember out at the Huntington Library Museum one time with my daughter when she was still alive, and we were watching a hummingbird that would fly very high and then just drop, and the gravity would increase so fast that it would chirp like a very high burp peep, and then it would fly up again and do the same thing. It was playing. Life forms play, which shows that visionary consciousness, is not limited to human beings, but is a concomitant of life forms. So that life forms have a very special quality, and human beings have a fermented version of this quality that can be enlarged, and that is to draw life through the mind into consciousness, into play. And once creative imagination comes into play, the realm is rich enough in a fifth dimension that space-time consciousness as a five-dimensional continuum is able to be the source of a new kind of form, and that new kind of form is art. And one of the greatest art forms is the person, who is so superior to the mind's individuality, to the mind's sense of identity, that It is a scalar that can hardly be measured. Our education, by phases, is a new way so that all of this can be made apparent by investigation. Investigation not simply to be able to think it through, but by being able to experience for oneself not only the transform of one's life experience into expanded visionary consciousness more and more as you get used to doing it, but a second transformation that happens in history. And that second transformation in history is that the art of the person that is able to emerge from a five-dimensional conscious time-space has a form which is a six-dimensional form of the person. And that six-dimensional form, when it comes into play, not just in the creative imagination and remembering of visionary consciousness, but when it comes into play in a bigger and bigger and deeper way, it begins to have creative remembering, and that's what history is. History is creative remembering. And just as creative imagination, making art forms able to be appreciated through critique so that they can be made better, more refined, more complex. Creative remembering in history allows for science forms to emerge, and those science forms are capable of an analytic. And so one of the deepest qualities of human maturation is that we are capable of the arts and the sciences, both of which require a larger dimensional sourcing than the individuality in the mind. And what we have discovered is that the individuality in the mind is only halfway home. But it falls prey to a famous abstract conundrum. If you only go halfway, any further progress that you would make on that basis would only be halfway, and you would never be able to arrive. This is called Zeno's paradox, and it was famous in Greek pre-Socratic antiquity. Achilles runs a race with a tortoise, but Achilles only goes halfway and then stops. And then he goes just another half and stops. The tortoise keeps going slowly but does not stop. This points out a conundrum which the mind is incapable of understanding except as a paradox. And that is this. If time is in unending duration, it will always reach whatever forms it is capable of purposing. But if it only goes halfway, partiality is repeatable indefinitely, and one will never arrive. And so the state of a mind which does not experience the continuum of time-space, especially with conscious time-space in its eternal continuum, will inevitably, as it becomes more and more synthesized, will become more and more synthetic, and will more and more experience that ultimate things are not reachable. They're not achievable. And to begin to have the worry, the anxiety, which Hegel introduced a term which Marx made famous, alienation. That one becomes alienated from all of the fundamentals that there are. One is alienated from nature. One is alienated from the culture that one used to be comfortable in. One is alienated from other people. And then it becomes chronic because one is alienated from oneself. And that there is no possibility of solution for this. And the point becomes one in late 19th century philosophy, the term existentialism was coined, and in the early 20th century it was raised to a fine point. And the whole concern in existentialism is with the absurdity of two layers: the absurdity of life itself, and then the absurdity of oneself and the whole social order. And that with these absurdities, there are only two synthetic conclusions that are eventually reached by a devolution. One with absurdity of life is suicide, and the other, absurdity of oneself in a social order that is forever unsatisfying, is murder. The first is killing oneself, the other is killing those others who are getting in the way of things working. And because one gets into the proliferation, it isn't just murder of another or of several, but it's mass murder. And two of the great works of philosophy of the mid-20th century by Albert Camus, this philosophy of the absurd, most poignantly put in his novel, The Stranger. The Stranger begins, "My mother died today," or was it yesterday? And the other is The Rebel, which is the absurdity of murder. The French existentialists received the most attention after the Second World War, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus. But it was the German existentialists who were the most profound, who early on saw that this is a devastating problem that occurs because the human mind is incapable of solving this, no matter how powerful it becomes in its synthesizing. Cannot do it. And it was Kant, in his critique of pure reason, who began this German language concern, and in the critique of practical reason raised it up, and in the critique of judgment came to the beginnings of an understanding that the difficulty was that human judgment, when it is critical, is aesthetic and not political. And so the critique of judgment by the old Kant in Königsberg was beginning the exploration, well then, what are aesthetic forms of society? What would be human forms of life that would be available for a critique so that they could be appreciated and improved and increase the appreciation? He never lived long enough to really explore the whole thing, but it acted as a trigger. And the trigger, once it was pulled, was that there obviously then is some wild area of civilization as yet unexplored, and the only person who could explore that new wilderness of possibility of civilization is the heroic artist, who must go out into the wilderness of the unknown possibilities of civilization and open up by exploration what those are. But at the same time, there was a recursive repression of political forms. Excuse me. I feel it. The quality is most evident in two figures that lived at the same time, Napoleon and Beethoven. And one finds Beethoven convinced that he had been gifted with a vision, a conscious vision of the new possible terrain of the wilderness of a civilization that had not yet taken place, because there was not yet a population of people who were going to make that civilization, and that the only way to engender a population of people who would then create that civilization through their creative remembering was to open up a quality of their mythic horizon that had been unexplored. And it wasn't the quality of images that were visual so much, nor the quality of language so much, though both were important, but it was the quality of feeling. That in the horizon of mythic experience, feeling was available for new horizons and new dimensions, new possibilities, because it had been opened up by a sequence of German composers. The first in the sequence was Johann Sebastian Bach. The second was Haydn, always called Papa Haydn fondly, but the real genius of it was Mozart. And Mozart's music, his musical works, about 626 of them survive. His musical works showed that this realm of feeling was capable not only on the individual level of, say, a piano sonata that you could play yourself, but it was available on levels of symphonies, like Symphony 41, the Jupiter Symphony, or on operas like The Magic Flute, that one could open up a scalar of new realms of feeling that went all the way from not the individual, but the person. Because the person would have to be an artist to be able to hear a sonata. A sonata form, or symphony form, or an opera form cannot be heard on the level of a culture, can only be heard by an educated ear, by someone who is artistic enough to be able to appreciate it. And since they're artistic enough to be able to appreciate it, they are also personable enough to creatively remember and begin to make history, to engender real history. And that history engendered then is what really civilization is. So that political forms are antithetical to civilization. They do not like civilization, nor do they like the wilderness explorers of the wildness of heroic art. One of the first things that the Soviet Union in its persecutions did was to curtail the artists and to make an ideological doctrine of it. The big state aesthetician was Plekhanov. You may only write things that are politically correct. You may only compose things that are going to help the masses understand that they're better off here and that you can be really punished if you don't cooperate. And so state art became more and more a stranglehold. And of course the Nazis excelled even the Soviet Union. It's not only the bonfires of the books that are not allowed and the bonfires of people who are not allowed, but it is the conflagration of anything that would allow anyone to peek outside of the structure that is approved. And so the number one thing of the National Socialist Party, when they came into power in 1933 in Germany, was to find those individuals who were most likely to formulate a powerful critique against them and a powerful analytic against them. And one of the most conspicuous figures in Germany was Karl Jaspers. Jaspers at the time was one of the most famous philosophers in Europe. He was 50 years old, but he had been married for many, many years to Gertrude Jaspers, who was Jewish. And one of his prize students was Hannah Arendt, who was Jewish. But Jaspers was such a colossal figure because he had not come to philosophy right away. He was famous before that of being the author of the first great psychopathology textbook. He was a psychiatrist. He was an existential psychiatrist way ahead of his time because he wrote his textbook in 1911. When this was hardly, if you look at the works of Carl Jung, he hardly had begun to do anything. And when you look at Freud, hardly anything. What you find is that Karl Jaspers' Psychopathology, it's still in print from the University of Chicago Press, 100 years later. It is a maturation from William James's psychology from 1890 of bringing the life understanding of James's great sentience and intelligence in his psychology all the way through the limits of the mind into a new visionary consciousness that could look back all the way through the mind and weave itself with experience in such a tight way that it could come back to the existential rituals of daily action with consciousness. And so one of the most powerful books that Jaspers finally wrote is called Reason and Existence. That you can come back to your existential reality, the phenomenon of your body, the phenomenon of the actions that you do in your life, with a phenomenologically accurate sense of conscious expansion, of creative imagination, and be able to see your actions and your life and your existence beyond the formal synthetic limits of mentality. So that you were able to approach a condition that the mind could not figure out with an expanded capability and confidence. And of course, this revolutionized the whole way in which someone could look at human beings. They were not just bodies that had experience that was integrated in minds, but that they were beings who had visionary consciousness that could achieve a spiritual personality, an art of being a person, which meant then that the maturation doesn't stop with the mind, but that it goes through the mind in a trance form. And when it goes through the mind in a trance form, literally, you no longer have just the water of nature, but it's able to be the wine of transformation. This is also a part of the expanded nature, because nature cares for this. And so when Jaspers finally wrote his first book on philosophy, he chose a theme in the early 1930s, Man in the Modern Age. And Man in the Modern Age was tremendous. It challenged almost everything about current philosophic understanding. And one of the biggest challenges was that there is no such thing as a mass, that the idea of a mass public is an illusion. It is fictive. Let's take a break and we'll come back. Hannah Arendt was a very scared girl. Her father died of advanced syphilis when she was just a couple of years old. And her storytelling grandfather died just a year before that. Then the mother remarried, and the new stepfather had two daughters, so they became stepsisters. And it's almost like the Cinderella story. Though the mother was her mother and cared for her, there was a jealousy of the other two daughters, because Hannah was always a very special, peculiar child. The literature on Hannah Arendt is growing apace, and one of the very best is a study of her by Julia Kristeva, who's one of the world's great philosophic critics. And this is translated and published by Columbia in 2001, and she says, did Hannah's reaction merely reflect the innocence of a 7-year-old girl? Or was it the first signs of a life that unfurls in thought and that appears to know that we can control the objects of our thoughts, whether it be something sad to be avoided or music, much better? Is it not the case that when I am deep in thought, I long for nothing? We might assume as much after reading the reflections of Hannah's mother. She has recently started thinking about her grandpa again. And she speaks about him with love and affection, but does she really miss him? I don't think so. Is thinking the only way to live with the dead, to keep from losing them and to deal with grief? We will find a trace of this precocious circumvention of death in a thought that longed for nothing, in the implicit debate that Hannah Arendt would later conduct with Heidegger's being towards death. Without shying away from her heartbreaking distress, Hannah created new ways of thinking about the common ground of the appearance, bonds with other people, sharing, and action. In the last work that she was able to complete in her life, Volume 2 of The Life of the Mind, Willing, which is her recutting and recalibrating Kant's critique of practical reason, she begins it this way. I concluded the first volume of The Life of the Mind with certain time speculations. This was an attempt to clarify a very old question, first raised by Plato, but never answered by him. Where is the topos noetos, the region of the mind in which the philosopher dwells? I reformulated it in the course of the inquiry as, where are we when we think? To what do we withdraw when we withdraw from the world of appearances? Stop all ordinary activities and start what Parmenides at the beginning of our philosophical tradition had so emphatically urged on us, look at what, though absent, is so reliably present to the mind. Framed in spatial terms, the question received a negative answer. though known to us only in inseparable union with the body that is at home in the world of appearances, by virtue of having arrived one day and knowing that one day it will depart, the invisible thinking ego is, strictly speaking, nowhere. It has withdrawn from the world of appearances, including its own body, and therefore also from the self of which it is no longer aware. This to the point that Plato can ironically call the philosopher a man in love with death, and Valéry, the great French poet, implying that the thinking ego loses all sense of reality and the real. Appearing self does not think. From this it follows that our question, where are we when we think, was asked outside the thinking experience, hence inappropriate. When we then decided to inquire into the time experience of the thinking ego, we found our question no longer out of place. Memory, the mind's power of having present what is irrevocably past and thus absent from the senses, has always been the most plausible, paradigmatic example of the mind's power to make invisibles present. When she was 18, she had matriculated a year ahead of all of the other students in a school where she had been in Königsberg, but because she was so impulsive and always a loner and always lost in thought or argumentatively present in the struggle, she was involved in a boycott, which you don't do in Prussian schools in the 1920s, and so she was exiled from the school. She was thrown out. And the mother made arrangements for her to stay with relatives in Berlin and to take courses at the preparatory for the University of Berlin schools. And one of her teachers was a Roman Catholic priest who was also an enormously cultivated man and wrote a number of very, very famous books, Romano Guardini. And he inspired her that perhaps there was some kind of deep intellectual challenge to religion, that it was not just about doctrines and rituals, but that one could investigate this. And out of this came her desire to try to understand what is it that makes someone then religious, not on the basis of religious revelation, but on the basis of philosophic conviction. And so her PhD thesis, when she went to university, became eventually on love and St. Augustine. And from then, it began to occur to her, because when she was there at the University of Marburg, the great philosophic star who had been there for a number of years was Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger was deep involved in a book which was going to be an enormous tome of redoing the fundamentals of all of philosophy, and it was going to be called Being and Time. Sein und Zeit. Being and Time. And at the first page of Being and Time, Heidegger put a quotation from one of Plato's most powerful later dialogues, the Sophist. A sophist in Plato's time was a teacher who prided themselves on knowing and being able to teach you what they knew. And they were like the New Age gurus today that have hundreds of thousands of people following them. But the protagonist in the dialogue, the Sophist, is Socrates, whose sole knowing was that he did not know. It's called Socratic Ignorance. That one is able, through a progressive application of a method of inquiry, to come to a point to where the pro and con of knowing collapse into a unity which is undivisible. And that unity, where it is undivisible, is not a decision of pro or con, but is the resolution that one cannot ultimately know, though one still is. And so the quotation that Heidegger put from Plato's Sophist at the beginning of Being and Time is, "You clearly have known for a long time what you mean when you say the word being, but we, who were once sure about it ourselves, have now become perplexed." He completed the first section of Being and Time, which is one of the most complex philosophic works ever written. It's like James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. There are so many hyphenated words used in such a highly technical philosophic way that it becomes almost like a super condensed, compressed jargon of specificity to the nth degree. But when he finished the first part of Being and Time, and it came to write the second part, the first part on being, the second part was going to be then time, he was never able to write it, though he lived another half century. Because the structure of Being and Time as it exists, for most of the 20th century, it was like Finnegan's Wake, it was the high water mark of phenomenological, existential philosophy in the world. Totally brittle. Because as soon as you bring the dimension of time into play with this structure, it granulates. The fineness of it is that it is like dust being held together as long as you don't breathe, as long as no one moves. It is a refined brittleness that will crumble as soon as it's exposed to any kind of a movement. That it exists in a mental space, but not in the space where time occurs. And so space-time granulates it. Perhaps the lines from one of Wallace Stevens' great poems, Asides on the Oboe, "The metal heroes that time granulates." For the years that Hannah Arendt was a student at Marburg, University of Marburg, she was not only captivated by Heidegger and his great project, but she fell in love with him because he was like the king of the rebels possible for someone like her, and began and sustained an affair that lasted for a number of years. And he was married, he had a couple of children, he was the most famous man at the school. This is something that you don't do, and yet he was captivated, not only by her, but by the incredible parallelities which were a part of her. She was Jewish, she was temperamental, she was brilliant, perhaps could outthink him. And in all of this welter of conflicting swirls, the quality that came out of Hannah Arendt was that there was something about time, there was something about the reality that space in the universe is similar to, but not the same as, a mental space. And that whatever occurs in a mental space must be given form so that it can have its objectivity. And her conviction was that it is political forms that are able to do this, and this is why we have them. To keep the cohesion of not just a mind, but of many minds, millions of minds, together in some kind of a stable form. And that without this symbolic, stable form of political arrangements held in structure by ideas, there would be no possibility then for there to be clarity in human life. The difficulty with this is a difficulty that emerged deeply in the work of Karl Jaspers. And before we get to talking about that for just a minute, let's go back to something that we began before the break and just reiterate and recapture something that is going on here. We're learning by phases. And one of the reasons that we're learning by phases instead of subjects is that it gives us an opportunity to continue our learning not only up to the mind, but through the mind, through the open mind, beyond, even into the wild beyond of infinities, and not feel that sometimes we're losing our capacity to be real. In fact, we're gaining our capacity to be able to engender reality. Each of the phases has an alternation, a pacing. There is a phase of process, and then there's a phase of form. And the phases of form then come in between two phases of process. And because the process can go forwards or come back, not as a regression, but as a recursive function of its being a flow, of its being an energy, of its being a dynamic, can go either way. When it comes back, one finds that the form, the objectivity of the form, gains a new kind of power, a new kind of order. It has an ordinal aspect to it that was not initially there. Like rituals that establish by their selected action the things done, which results in objectivities in the world. When ritual comes out of the process of nature, it has that ritual action quality. You can call it karma, or you can call it pragmatic. Either one will do. But when the energies of experience come back into the rituals, they add an order that was not there before, a power of meaning that was not there before, and that is, rituals now can also be ceremonies. The same for symbols. Symbols come out of experience, out of the mythic phase of experience. But when they're in between the differential phase of vision and the integral phase of myth, those two phases are not like nature and ritual that can flow together in a participatory parallel, but they weave through their energies. And so symbols acquire the ability to have pattern. That they are not just integral, but they are integral and differential in terms of their patterning. And that the patterning is not just simply differential in a radiant way, but is differential also in a chiral way. but the chirality of pattern is not noticeable right away. Where it comes into place definitely is in the very next process, not the process of nature or myth or vision, but the process of history. Because the form that's in between the process of vision and the process of history are the forms of art. And when art forms have both differential processes coming into it, they do not weave and make patterns, but they're like resonances that set up a harmonic. And so history, coming back into works of art, give them the capacity to have a higher order called harmony. And persons, the art of the person, is a person now who has a capacity of not just being differentially prismatic as opposed to existentially pragmatic, but they have this ability to extend their differential person through sets of resonance into the process of creative remembering, which is history. And that creative remembering then, like any phase, will work both ways. It not only enables the person as an art form, as a spirit, to have a harmony, but that harmony helping to make creative remembering, which loops back and increases the harmonic. As one becomes more acquainted with that, one recognizes that there's a further resonance in the harmonic. And that further resonance is that one's person is related more to something further than it is to the individuality in the mind. That the individuality in the mind, no matter how transformed it might be, becomes increasingly less significant in terms of the further harmonic that is available, and that further harmonic is where science comes into play. Because scientific forms are the forms of the cosmos. And so the easiest way to say it is that the transformed person becomes transformed again and is capable of a cosmic relationality. And the easiest way to imagine it initially, creatively, the movement from the individuality in the mind to the spiritual person is like the transform of fermentation of making wine. But the second transform is distilling the wine into cognac. And so the forms of science are like a double transformed, a distilled quality of the prismatic. And when you distill a prismatic form, like forms of art, forms of spirit, forms of person, the distillation of that lends them a direct harmonic relationality, differentially, to the infinite cosmos. Not the infinite cosmos as something that cannot be formed, but that is formed, but is not formed integrally, is formed differentially in the increased array of possibilities. So that the ancient saying, in the actual period of about 2,500 years ago, the ancient saying was always some form of the way in which the Egyptians initially talked 3000 BC, that Ra was the Lord of history, but that beyond the Lord of history was an unnamed capacity that emerged creatively out of history. And while Ra was the Lord of history, able to be reborn each day into eternity, the unnamed divinity, the divineness, was actually eternity itself, the eternity of the world, the eternity of the cosmos, that has its objectivity in between two processes, the process of history and the process of nature. And that is why the universe, though infinite, has an ability to engender the energies of nature from its own radiance, its own chirality. And the first thing that comes into play out of that is time. Time is not the fourth dimension, but the first dimension. And it is the movement of time that generates space. So that space as a generation is actually the first form in the material universe. It is space itself. Because time, in its pure movement, is unsegmented and only becomes geometrical as space becomes generated and created. And so it is space-time itself that is a fabric. One of the predictions of Einstein's specific theory of relativity was that space itself is a form. And it was confirmed last year because around very powerful gravitational sources, one should be able to detect the frame dragging of space. And this was done. So that scientifically we understand now that space itself is a creation. It is an objectivity. And it has its movement and can be, under certain conditions, condensed. And one of the conditions is that it has an event horizon threshold beyond which no radiant energy can come out, and here we have a black hole. And that the black hole itself has the quality of being a singularity that's like a Bose-Einstein concentrate raised to its ultimate infinite condensation, that it is not just a unity, but is an infinite unity, is a singularity. One of the volumes that we're going to look at starting in 2 weeks, when we begin with science, is Kip Thorne's beautiful book, Black Holes and Time Warps, Einstein's Outrageous Legacy. Kip Thorne has been at Caltech for a number of decades and is the #1 researcher in the world under John Wheeler, initially on gravity, trying to find gravity waves, trying to determine many things. And we're going to pair with it a book, Niels Bohr's Times, by Abraham Pius, who was a physicist who knew all these people personally and was brilliant himself. So we're going to take Einstein and Bohr, because it's Bohr and Einstein together, exactly at the same time, early in the 20th century, that you begin to find that not only does art eclipse political structures, but that science eclipses political structures even more. So that political forms to survive have to limit our maturation in terms of art, but they have to eventually forbid our exploration in science. Which means that we have a lot of work cut out for us, because especially in the United States, the new federalism is been allying itself for a long time to cutting back on science, to limiting it, to being able to only do ritual forms that are pseudoscience rather than to do real analytic. This is true of the limit of arts, but the limits of science even more so. And in between, what is obviated is the conscious, creative remembering, which is history. Political forms are not makers of history. They are enemies of history. And this is why history is reduced then. Reduced to chronicles of wars, reduced to chronicles of leaders, reduced down to lists and to mulched things that parade themselves as if they were histories. This is not new. In between Thucydides and Tacitus, the greatest historian was Polybius. And Polybius wrote about the rise of the Roman Empire, and he wrote about it 2,200 years ago. The beginning of Book 9, he wrote this: "In composing my history, I have deliberately followed a uniform plan, and this, I recognize, imposes a certain austerity upon the whole work, with the result that there is only one type of reader who is likely to judge it favorably and find that it suits his taste. Most other authors, if not every one, can appeal to a wide and diverse public by including all the various modes of historical writing in their work. Thus, those who enjoy a story are attracted by the genealogical treatment of history, the curious and those with antiquarian interest by a recital of the planting of colonies, of the foundation of cities and of their ties of kinship, and the statesmen by the actions of nations, cities, and rulers. Now, as I have concentrated my attention strictly upon the last category and made it the exclusive object of my whole composition, the work has shaped, as I explained, to appeal only to one type of reader, and thus will scarcely make attractive reading for the majority, as one can observe. I have set forth elsewhere at length the factors which impelled me to this. One of the things that occurs increasingly in Polybius is the detection by his historical analytic that there is a wild card at play in the game of the world. And that wild card, he gave it the Greek name Tyche, like Psyche, Tyche. The Latin form of it is fortune. Lady Luck. Dame Fortune, Fortuna, as she was called at the end of the Roman Empire in the early medieval period. One just doesn't know about fortune. In the Tarot Major Arcana, you see the Wheel of Fortune. And the Wheel of Fortune has three figures in the center of it, and they perpetually chase each other around. And where it stops, no one knows, because it is just pure luck or fortune. And increasingly, Polybius, who was extraordinarily lucky, he not only was intelligent, but he was taken as a prisoner to Rome after his province, his country, was conquered by the Romans. And because he was so exceptional, he was put in one of the most powerful houses in Rome, the Scipios. And he was with the Scipio who was able to win the Third Punic War when Rome conquered the Carthaginian Empire. It was one of the most devastating conquests of all time. The Romans, who had been persecuted for a whole generation by Hannibal, the great military general from Carthage, who had crossed over the Alps with huge army and war elephants and roamed up and down the Italian peninsula, terrifying the Roman population for 17 or 18 years, that when Rome finally conquered Carthage, they turned into a brutal mass obliteration of Carthage. They tore down every building in the city. They uprooted every foundation of every building in the city. They poisoned the ground with poisonous salts so nothing could ever live there again. The modern city of Tunis is some distance away on ground that was not polluted and destroyed. Polybius shows this was the beginning of the brutality in the character of the Roman nascent empire. And it was because of that brutality that they were able to literally out-brutalize in war everyone else, because they had no stops to their violence. There were no limits to their mass murder. And it was this that introduced not only the taciturn severity to the Roman character, but at the very center of it, a pathos that they were also victims of this attitude, of this outlook. This is why the later Caesars all became nightmarishly insane with power, because they envisioned that the entire Roman people, empire, had come to their sole power and authority, and then found that that imploded and became like a black hole, which could not be filled by no matter how many victims you had, that there was no way to get rid of this. And dynasty after dynasty, the Caesars, the Flavians, finally they resorted to emperors adopting people from outside of any family contact, trying to get around this issue, and came to worship the dying god, so that when they seized upon having a completely new religious context instead of the Greek gods and brought in Christianity, they emphasized the death of Christ rather than the living Jesus. And one finds from there on Roman councils doing the same thing to Christianity that they compulsively, all totalitarian states will always do. They keep condensing it towards a black hole threshold where it collapses in upon itself and leaves a vacuum. It leaves a nothing. And the closer one gets to success, the higher the dread underneath it. And so one gets this shrinking ratio where it is going to come not to equilibrium, because it can never reach equilibrium. It always reaches a higher and higher anxiety until one crosses from the quality of neurotic to the quality of psychotic. So that the inevitable pattern of empire is psychotic war, ceaseless, without end, and almost unconsciously will do exactly the things to keep that war not only going, but keep the level of the brutality more and more massive. Because this is an attempt to save authority and power from collapsing in upon itself, not to lose to someone else, but to lose to oneself. And so it becomes a very difficult thing. The finest work in the world to talk about this is the Bhagavad Gita in the Mahabharata, the Great Indian War. And so next week we'll take an interval and I'll give you the 7-dimensional jet stream version of the Bhagavad Gita next week.